Hello and welcome to another episode of Digital Pulse. Today we're really diving deep into something I think has been weighing on all of us, the crisis in Gaza. It's been a year since the Hamas attack on Israel, and we want to try to understand the human cost of this conflict, go beyond the headlines and look at what's really happening on the ground.
Right.
So just to kind of set the scene for everyone, October 7th, 2023, Hamas launches this surprise attack on Israel. Israeli officials reported 11,139 people killed and over 250 taken hostage. Just a horrific event.
Yeah.
And of course, the story doesn't end there. Israel responds with a huge military operation in Gaza. And the impact on civilians has been, well, devastating doesn't even begin to describe it.
Yeah.
So to help us understand the full scale of this crisis, we have our expert with us today. Could you maybe give us a sense of the damage? I mean, what are we even talking about here?
Well, we're talking about a humanitarian catastrophe.
Yeah.
And it's massive. Palestinian officials say nearly 42,000 people have been killed in the past year and over 96,000 wounded. Yeah, I mean, just think about a city you're familiar with. Now imagine almost half the population gone. That's Gaza.
That's unbelievable.
And tragically, over half of those killed are women and children.
Those numbers are just, I don't even know, unimaginable. And to think that's probably an underestimation.
It is. Access to some areas is incredibly limited, because of the destruction. And the security concerns are still so high. Just recovering bodies in the middle of all this is a huge task. So the true figures, they're probably much higher.
It's just grim. And it's not just those immediate casualties either, right? It's also the millions who've been displaced from their homes.
Absolutely. The UN estimates 90% of Gaza's 2.3 million people have been displaced. And think about this. Gaza already had one of the highest population densities in the world. Now add in the destruction of homes, infrastructure, essential services. It's a recipe for chaos and suffering.
I can't even fathom just constantly on the move, searching for safety, for basic needs. Can you paint a picture of what that actually looks like for families?
Well, many of them have had to flee their homes multiple times. They're living in these overcrowded tent camps along the coast, often with very limited access to electricity, clean water, even basic sanitation. These shelters, they offer very little protection from the elements, so they become breeding grounds for disease.
Oh, gosh.
And hunger is a constant threat. Plus, the psychological toll of living with this uncertainty, this constant fear, it's unimaginable.
So you have this complete collapse of basic services and infrastructure, all on top of this already horrific humanitarian situation.
Exactly. And it all has such far-reaching consequences. The World Bank estimates the damage to Gaza from just the first 3 months. Just the first 3 months of the conflict. It was $18.5 billion.
Oh, my God.
Yeah, and to put that in perspective, that's basically the entire combined economic output of both the West Bank and Gaza in 2022. Gone in just 3 months.
That's, unconscionable. And even that only covers the first few months, the long-term economic impact of this. It's going to be felt for generations. So what does that $18.5 billion even translate to, like in terms of physical damage?
It's a level of destruction that's hard to grasp. We're talking about over 92% of main roads damaged or destroyed. So that cripples transportation and makes it much harder to access essential goods and services. Then you have more than 84% of health facilities impacted. So access to healthcare is severely limited. And maybe most alarmingly, almost 70% of water and sanitation infrastructure is out of commission.
70%.
Yes, including all 5 wastewater treatment facilities in Gaza.
That is a terrifying thought. What does that mean for the average person living there?
It means waking up every day and not knowing if you'll have clean water, not knowing if you'll be able to, access basic sanitation. It's the constant fear of disease outbreaks, knowing that even the most basic necessities are no longer guaranteed. This level of precarity, of desperation, it's very hard to imagine if you haven't experienced it.
It's just overwhelming to think about. And then, of course, there's the international response. We have an article here that highlights the Maldives president's address to the UN. And he used some really strong language, calling the situation in Gaza genocide and urging the international community to hold Israel accountable.
Right.
Those are serious accusations. And I think it's important to unpack what that term actually means.
Yeah.
In a legal context, in a political context.
Absolutely.
What does genocide actually mean?
You're right. It's a term that carries a lot of weight. It shouldn't be used lightly. Legally, it refers to acts committed with a specific intent to destroy a group, in whole or in part. And that group can be national, ethnical, racial, or religious. But that intent, That's the key here.
Okay.
Proving genocide, it means you have to build a case, one that demonstrates a deliberate plan to exterminate a specific group of people. It requires a lot.
Yeah.
Meticulous documentation, investigation, legal process.
Right. So while we're talking about a situation in Gaza that is horrific, so much suffering, so much loss of life, determining whether it actually meets the definition of genocide, that's a really complex legal question.
Exactly.
And it goes way beyond what we can really get into in our deep dive today.
Absolutely. You have international courts, tribunals that are specifically designed to investigate these kinds of claims.
Right.
So what we can do, what we should do, is focus on the tangible needs on the ground right now and the efforts to address this humanitarian crisis.
And one of those groups working on the ground is the Shelter Cluster. I think we touched on them earlier.
Yeah.
For those who might not know, can you explain who they are, what they're doing in Gaza?
Sure. So the Shelter Cluster is kind of a coordinating body. It's led by the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, and the International Organization for Migration, IOM. And they bring together all these different humanitarian organizations, ones that are working in the field of shelter and non-food items. So they're trying to make sure there's a coordinated and effective response to these displacement crises. In Gaza, they're on the front lines, providing emergency shelter, tents, blankets, all those essential items people need when they've lost their homes.
And they're facing an uphill battle, to say the least. I mean, you mentioned earlier 90% of Gaza's population displaced. What does that kind of need actually look like?
So to give you an idea, the Shelter Cluster estimates that 900,000 people in Gaza need tents and bedding alone.
Wow.
That's almost half the population. And that's just one thing, right? We haven't even talked about clean water, sanitation, healthcare, food, psychosocial support, all of it. It's a huge task. And the ongoing security concerns, the restrictions on movement, the sheer scale of the destruction, it all makes it even harder.
So even just getting aid into Gaza is a challenge.
It is, yeah. These aid organizations are working so hard to deal with all the logistical and bureaucratic hurdles just to get supplies into Gaza. What they're relying on humanitarian corridors that aren't always open, or reliable. And they're facing security risks every single day.
It's not just about providing relief now either. It's about rebuilding an entire society from scratch. How do you even begin to do that in a place like Gaza?
That's the question, isn't it? And there's no easy answer. The Shelter Cluster estimates it could take 40 years.
40 years.
To rebuild all the homes destroyed in Gaza. And that's only if the flow of materials remains stable. 40 years. That's an entire generation.
Wow.
Growing up surrounded by all of this.
It makes you wonder, where do you even start to rebuild after something like this?
Right. It's a huge question. And there are no easy answers. The Shelter Cluster, they estimate it could take 40 years.
40 years. To do what?
To rebuild all the homes in Gaza that were destroyed. And that's if the materials keep coming in at the current rate. 40 years, that's an entire generation.
It's heartbreaking. And like you said, it's not just about rebuilding the buildings. How do you even address the invisible scars?
Yeah.
The toll this has taken on people, especially the kids.
You're absolutely right. That psychological and social impact, it's going to last for years. Imagine being a child who's never known anything else. Just war, displacement, loss, witnessing violence, losing people they love, living with this constant fear. That has a serious effect on their development, their mental health, everything.
It's so easy to get caught up in the numbers, like we hear these statistics, the casualties, the displaced people, but it's easy to forget those are real lives.
It's true.
Hearing you describe it, the reality, the individuals behind those numbers, it's a powerful reminder.
It's a cost that's often overlooked. We get caught up in the politics, the rebuilding efforts, but we can't forget about the human cost.
Yeah.
And the international community, they have a responsibility here, not just to address the immediate needs, but to invest in the long-term recovery. And that includes the psychological well-being of everyone there, especially the most vulnerable.
It's a long road ahead, and it's easy to feel overwhelmed by all of it. What can our listeners do, even from far away? Where do we even begin to make a difference?
It is overwhelming, but you can't let that stop you from doing something. Every little bit helps. Just talking about it, raising awareness, taking action, it all contributes to change. One thing people can do is support the aid organizations working in Gaza. They're the ones providing direct relief to the people who need it most.
Do you have any recommendations for listeners who might want to learn more, maybe offer support?
Of course. There's the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees, UNRWA, the International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC, and Doctors Without Borders, MSF. They're all doing really critical work in Gaza: healthcare, clean water, sanitation, psychological support. You can find out more about their work on their websites and how to help.
This has been, well, he's been a sobering deep dive. It's a reminder of the human cost of this conflict and the long road to recovery ahead. Thank you for joining us today for this really important conversation. We can't forget the people whose lives have been changed by this. Their stories deserve to be heard, and we need to support them as they rebirth their lives. That's all for this episode of Digital Pulse. Thanks for listening.